the solution of vertical farming proposes something quite different that allows us to apply these manufacturing principles. So traditionally, we had quite a low level of control. We only got 1 or 2 opportunities to iterate our growing conditions and the changes that we do our harvests. And greenhouses allowed us to accelerate that to achieve multiple crop cycles per year. And now with indoor vertical farming, we're almost able to achieve thousands of crop cycles a year when you stagger them appropriately throughout the year, and a much more precise level of control. So with that greater level of control, you're able to have much greater influence over the inputs and therefore the outputs that are more familiar to a kind of factory type setting, except that it's much more complex with biosystems. But similarly, you can still apply these principles of lean that were used in the automotive industry, for example. So today, I'm just going to cover some industry challenges and why I've proposed lean as a potential solution. I'm going to propose some ideas of lean tools applied to the case study farm. I work in collaboration with Farm Urban, a farm in Liverpool city centre, and they were really keen to integrate some of these principles. So I'm going to propose 5 lean principles: identify value, map the value stream, create flow, and establish pull, and finally pursue perfection in the context of a book that I've read from Womack and Jones, which is kind of one of the places that people go to for suggestions and ideas in lean. And then some other lean tools that could be implemented, and then finally integrate some of those suggestions for the case study farm, and then conclude with some of the ideas that I've come to find and propose some future work. So the vertical farming industry has expanded rapidly in recent years, and people say it's a bit of a combination of manufacturing principles and futuristic farming, with all sorts of opportunities to eliminate waste in the way that lean production does, and focusing on areas to add value. With this new industry, one of the key reported problems is human labour. 316 participants in the global CEA census. The largest challenge reported by growers was labour, and it typically accounts for around 56% of operating costs. So it's really key to try and improve these things. Whilst Japan, which is one of the leaders in this sector, has reported they've been able to reduce labour costs by around 50%. So I've tried to scan the literature to find, or in industry, to find ideas of how they've actually managed to achieve those 50% of labour reductions. But although there's mention of manufacturing principles in one of the conferences in Atlanta on lessons from shuttered farms, they discussed that if they could rebuild their farms, they would spend a lot more money on incorporating process flow and manufacturing principles. There's very little suggestion of what can actually be done to reduce these costs. So that's why I decided to do this exploratory research. And why did I choose lean principles? Because there's many other different frameworks that I could have chosen from, whether that's Six Sigma, total quality management, just in time, agile. Well, we consulted 2 higher level frameworks, and vertical farming being in a new industry with an absence of regularized and consistent data and consistent output seemed like a good choice for lean, as lean manufacturing emphasizes waste of all kinds and doesn't require standards. And as I mentioned before, yeah, the labor efficiency can improve quite substantially. So this seemed like a good fit. The aims and objectives of the research that I set out and presented in the Manufacturing Systems Conference was to assess which process improvement methodologies are suitable for vertical farming, to investigate the different lean manufacturing implementation methods, to evaluate how these lean principles can be applied to VF in the context of the case study, and to lay groundwork for further exploration of these principles in the sector. So the case study that I was working with in Farm Urban is a 220 metre squared commercial farm. It's currently in commission of developing their standard operating procedures and getting certification. Can produce around 200 kilograms of leafy greens a week. and they utilize mobile vertical tower systems known as ZipGrow, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, and which plenty use, which received the biggest investment. And their product offering is having a box with 4 live lettuces and fresh herbs. So this is the kind of context that I was thinking about applying the manufacturing principles within. The growing area of the farm is kind of combined with the packaging area. It's all within the same space, and there's pipes, and the transport route goes through the farm. There's kind of the washing area and the sump right next to the system, so it could be considered quite cluttered. And with that comes an increased risk of contamination. But as the standard operating procedures are still under development, there's a lot of flexibility of how to arrange these different resources and the process flow of the farm. So the 5 lean principles that I discussed previously, identify value, is from Womack and Jones's, starts off with identify value, which is first defining what the value is to the end customer. Mapping the value stream, so identifying all the processes, all the steps in the process, and eliminating those that don't add value. Creating flow, so organizing each value step to occur in tight sequence to provide value to the customer as quickly as possible, and reducing those steps that don't add value. Establish pull, so developing processes so that the product is in demand, as opposed to having the product pushed to the customer. So building your farm to the right size of the potential market, as opposed to trying to predict it without having had any validation. And seek perfection, so striving for perfection, incorporating continuous improvement, and developing reliable processes. For those that aren't aware of what lean manufacturing principles necessarily entail and how the system was created, it's what Toyota production used to grow their business from having very small factories, but being very flexible and improving their labor efficiency and output consistently to become one of the world leaders. And a lot of it is combined with Japanese culture, but they've really integrated these 5 principles to be able to improve the efficiency of their systems. So I'm going to zoom into each one of these particular principles. So in identify value, it's part of an iterative process of continuously trying to identify what in your farm adds value to the customer. So the whole process is within the customer's perspective. And that means doing market research and feedback surveys. It means every time you lose a customer, trying to understand why you lost that customer in the first place. So 4 questions, for example, that would be really helpful when doing this integrating this particular principle would be: what exactly are the crops that the customers want? How much do they want? How do they want it delivered? And how much they want to pay? A lot of these questions are intrinsic and almost intuitive to most farmers, but actually making a really deliberate practice to do them as frequently as possible allows you to improve your farm consistently. Another way to integrate this is to identify the crops and practices that earn money, and those should be tracked accordingly. So one example would also to assign value to a tray or a tower, and say how much money is that worth, which would be the number of crops within that system multiplied by the crop sales price minus any associated costs, and trying to get that for each individual crop, so you can eliminate those crops that aren't adding substantial profit and increase the number of crops that are adding more profit to be able to increase the profitability of your farm. The second principle, map the value stream, is really about understanding how the value flows through an organization, identifying value added and non-value added activities and breaking them apart. So within the scope of the case study, we were looking at harvesting and packaging. And it's really, the best way to do this is to confine the scope to just a small part of the farm and slowly widen it as you become more familiar with the process. So this is a simple chart that we've done where from the process of inspecting the crops to harvesting them and to packaging them, you identify that there's the non-value added steps, such as moving things around, extracting towers to the workbench, arranging packaging supplies. Those are all tasks that don't add any value. And the value added steps are, for example, assembling the packaging, harvesting the crops into the box, adding the herbs and sealing the box, and then quality checks and placing it for delivery, for example, aren't value added activities. So in lean, the objective should be to eliminate as many of the non-value added steps as possible, and then make sure that every single movement or task is intentional towards making the actual product more profitable. And then alongside that, you outline process steps, such as capturing process data around how much time is spent on each activity. So you can highlight bottlenecks and remove those that, or try and reduce the time of those that spend a lot of time. So for arranging packaging supplies, for example, you realize that things are rather far apart, for example, when you're trying to gather, in this case, a box for their product, different cups to have live herbs and lettuces, and those things were quite scattered, and you had to fill the water. Maybe you had a small jug rather than a larger jug, so you had to keep topping up the water, and that would take 10 minutes. So that would be obviously the thing that you need to try and shorten the time to be able to enhance the flow of the system. So the principle create flow is essentially, flow is from the moment that a customer makes an order to the point where you deliver a product, it should be as seamless and fluid as possible without any waiting. Any type of waiting is a form of waste. And there are certain techniques that one can integrate to try and avoid waiting. So two main methods that we explored were first in, first out principle and one piece flow. So first in, first out principle, I think, is really useful and applicable to vertical farming, because you are able to give a crop a precise environment that it needs for a particular part of the growth stage. So for example, say you have a lettuce that you integrate into a system, and you have the crop growth recipe for the first growth stage, and you can provide the right level of nutrients, the right climate, the right spectrum of light, and then push the crop through as it reaches the next growth stage into the second growth environment. And then the third one, and then for the fourth stage, for example, I know that you can add green lighting towards the end of a growth stage to be able to reduce some of the chemicals that make it either less tasty or less nutritious. And having a system designed within that way is actually rather rare in vertical farming. I haven't seen too many systems that push a crop through a series of growth environments. I know that Introvision's gravity flow system is able to achieve this, and they speak of having a kind of this push-pull system where the crops go in one end and come out the other end, and it's used in greenhouses in the Netherlands. But I've only very occasionally seen it within a vertical farming system. Another method to increase flow even is one piece flow, where the workstations for certain activities are right next to each other. And one great way to achieve this is a U-cell layout. So you can see here in this diagram, you might have the box or the packaging preparation station. You're filling the cups with their live lettuces. You do the quality checks and prepare it, and then it goes in where either the herbs or the edible flowers are added, the quality assessment station, and then it goes out. And by having that U-cell layout, you follow a very continuous place where things come into to that workstation area and then come out the same direction, either out the exit or delivery. And you're able to have two people simultaneously run in that area at the same time. So the other two principles, establish pull, is essentially allowing, you're not pushing crops onto the customers, instead you're allowing them to pull them out of your system or be able to make an order, and you're growing to the demand that you have. So in farm, one of the vertical farming companies that's become blown up over the past year and a half has systems in the UK, in Marks and Spencer's, and in Germany, and their business model of having these systems as almost like a vending machine within supermarkets has been really effective to incorporate this principle, which is kind of almost shown by their massive increase in sales over the coronavirus. I know that they've witnessed a 200% increase in sales because of the increased amount of people going to supermarkets within the pandemic. And there's a lot of other people doing these kind of systems within supermarkets or within offices, and establishing that pull system where it's kind of grown to the demand that they have has been quite effective. Finally, pursue perfection is about continuous improvement. So one way that we've integrated this on the farm is by using 5 whys analysis. So say there's a problem on the farm, maybe the propagation system hasn't been draining properly on certain levels. You'd break that up into asking why 5 times to be able to get to the root cause of the problem. But also each one of those answers will kind of highlight a particular problem in your farm. So for example, say the first answer to a propagation system would be draining is, well, the second and third levels don't drain, resulting in stagnant water. The second answer would be the pressure isn't high enough to draw water up to the elbow pieces. You'd get maybe through a series of engineering questions that could be applied also to a marketing problem that you might have had. Maybe the fourth why would be the system's outsourced and built by a supplier, and that was due to a lack of understanding of plumbing and DIY from the staff within the company, which means that perhaps you should be training those people within plumbing to be able to avoid these problems reoccurring. But you also are able to tackle the problem on a surface level too. Another example of pursuit affection would be combining these principles with artificial intelligence for crop growth recipes, so that you have an algorithm that is constantly gathering data and providing a better solution to the growth environments for each individual crop. And then there are a few other techniques, which I won't go into too much detail, but enhance continuous improvement Kaizen. So developing improvement routines, say having a weekly walk around the farm and taking notes of each individual system that you feel like could do with an improvement, but being very deliberate about that practice. Focusing on the most needed improvements, the limiting factor, so the thing that could bring you the most efficiency improvement within your farm, takes a really keen eye. Again, identifying value is a really effective way to do that, but it also goes hand in hand with the natural biology of crops. You have the limiting factor of a crop, whether maybe it's not doesn't have the right temperature. The crop grows only as fast as its weakest link. So that also applies to the enhanced biology, the growing of the crops, as well as the actual floor layout of the farm. And one way to kind of promote this upgrading of standards within your farm is that by having your standard operating procedures printed out on the shop floor and requiring them to be dated and constantly monitoring them to make sure that they're actually being updated frequently, maybe once a month, to encourage to see that marginal improvements are constantly being made to these processes and systems. And comparing your farm to your farm, so making sure that you have key performance metrics. I've been doing interviews with farms across the country, as well as some outside of the UK. And it's actually very rare that when I ask them whether they have any key performance metrics or KPIs, very frequently their main KPI is just revenue. And they're not looking at how they can increase the performance of their farm through things such as the energy performance, making sure that the kilograms of produce per kilowatt hour is being driven up to be able to improve the productivity, or the amount of water, or the amount of man hours per kilogram of produce is being reduced. And having those metrics allows you to really, once you're aware of it, you're able to manage it more precisely. The fifth thing is, as well, don't wait for things to go wrong, constantly trying to improve the systems and countering potential problems that could go wrong before they actually happen. A few effective tools to be able to do that are spaghetti diagrams. So in a spaghetti diagram, which aligns very well with mapping the value stream, is where you track people's movements within a farm to different workstations and just draw exactly where they go. And the idea is then to tidy up the strings so that they're much more neater and organized, and there's less movement between things. So that would involve rearranging things and a bit of experimentation. And it's quite a simple tool to be able to improve the process flow within a factory layout. There's the 5 S's, so sorting out your equipment, setting it in order, shining it, to making sure it's clean so you can see where things go wrong and things aren't dirty, so it kind of really highlights when there's something that's an issue. One way they do it in Toyota, for example, is everyone would wear white lab coats, so that if your lab coat is even a little bit dirty, you know there's an inefficiency in the system, there's a form of waste that you can begin to refine. Creating standards and sustaining. So those are considered the 5S organizing principles within Lean. And then having a Kanban system, which entails having these bins, or having a Kanban board, which is kind of like Trello or Asana, to be able to highlight when things come out of the system and when there's a deficiency that you're able to top things up. So in terms of the case study farm, some of the proposed changes that we suggested were having the vertical tower systems, if you had individual crops, rearranging them to another configuration where you could have a first in, first out sort of arrangement. So rather than constantly moving them back and forth, having them in a way where you assign a quadrant. So say there's 4 different systems here, one of them represents each week of the month, and they represent one particular crop. So you're able to put it in and then arrange the next growth environment to be tailored towards that particular crop. It would be moving all the equipment out of the growing area. So this could be separated and protected from pests, for example, by having webbing around it, and avoiding any going into the growing area unless you're adding crops. And then having a U-cell layout within the far right towards the exit, so it's as close as possible to the exit. And these really marginal improvements in efficiency of keeping things closer together and more compact and towards the area where they're needed is particularly effective for reducing time. Another suggestion would be to anticipate the customer needs. So to ask customers constantly what they think about the packaging, for example, and whether it's convenient, and trying to really pry those insights from them rather than wait for them to give you that feedback. Having mobility, which is already within the zip racks, they have wheels underneath, allows the mobility, which allows you to move things out of the way and ensure maintainability. And just generally having things out of the way allows for a reduced risk of contamination. So other recommendations that we started to implement were actually transplanting directly into the systems, rather than taking things out and putting it onto a workbench and adding them in and then putting the towers back. Having a bit of a shortcut where you carry around a trolley of your propagated seedlings and transplant them directly in, and the same thing when you're harvesting allows to save a substantial amount of time. There's also carrying around, for example, a particular toolkit around your waist on a tool belt, and therefore you're carrying around the things around you that you need consistently, rather than having to search for the different tools that you might need. As well as when you're actually harvesting, sorting them out as you're harvesting, rather than putting them to the workbench again, sorting them out, looking for the clean herbs. Perhaps just even having elastic bands around your wrists allows you to harvest them out that you need, organize it, and put it away for harvest while having that separation, which avoids extra work later down the line. The other recommendations that I suggested, so calculating the cost per plant, rack or tower, so you can kind of drive that improvement, and reorganizing the resources near to the point of use, and implementing visual controls, so having signage so that quality assessment and quality checks are less necessary, because the workers on the shop floor are constantly aware of what they could do to improve their setup. So the conclusions from my talk are: vertical farming benefits from an unprecedented control and rapid crop cycles that enable the implementation of these manufacturing methodologies. I've just given a brief overview of some of the main lean principles as a method to engage with some of the labour challenges and improve the customer experience and boost profits of the farm. This is based off an exploratory paper that I did for the CIRP Manufacturing Systems Conference, and lays the foundation for further research and exposes some of the voids in the knowledge base, as currently there's been very little discussion of what can be done to improve the labour efficiency on farms. Here's some links to my research. The paper on this will be available shortly. I'm just waiting for it to be published, but it's currently in press. I've got some other papers. You can check me out on ResearchGate and LinkedIn. I'd just like to thank the organisers of the webinar series and my co-authors from the paper that I did, Farm Urban, for letting me use their farm as a case study, and my PhD funders. I also had some initial discussions with Peter Lane that kind of informed the initial research and this talk, so I'd also like to thank him. And thank you very much for listening. I'd be really interested in your comments around what maybe people that own a vertical farm have done to improve the labour efficiency on their own configuration farm, as well as any questions or advice. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Francis. Thank you very much. Really interesting. Some nice practical points, as well as some good theory there. We have a few questions. I'm just sharing the question link again. Reminder, you can be anonymous or you can be yourself in these questions, and you can vote for the questions you would like to see prioritized. So I'll begin with a question from Anonymous. And Anonymous is asking if lean is a good fit for a young industry without standards, will companies have to switch to a different system later?
Okay. Yeah, so I think, as I've said, there's very few frameworks been applied to this sector. And because I've noticed trends of certain lean principles being applied within the plant factory book developed by the Japanese that were quite ahead of us, and I've seen some techniques integrated but with no discussion around it, whether that's in images, tracking time of certain employees. It's correct in saying that there might be better alternatives, but I think there needs to be a discussion about each one of those frameworks applied to be able to compare them. And a lot of the techniques applied in lean are kind of cross-applicable to almost any organization, to make them either more efficient or more conscious of where they're spending their time, more deliberate with the time that they're spending on their farm, and ensuring a more an enhanced customer experience, which sounds a little bit vague, but I just think that conscious practice of looking at it from that lens is particularly useful for any business, which has been seen by companies such as the Lean Startup, the book, The Lean Startup, that's being applied to many different organizations at the moment. And there was a book that I read, I've actually got it here because I was just reading it before my talk to recap, The Lean Farm, where they applied it to conventional agriculture as well, by Ben Hartman. And they found it really, really effective, where they could reduce the capacity of their farm and the amount of farms that the kind of fields that they had in operation, while boosting profitability massively. I really think there's a lot of value here in applying some of the main principles with very little downfall. One of the only caveats would be to ensure that you don't waste too much time doing a massive lean transformation, for the risk that you might spend a lot of time on something that doesn't actually boost the productivity. That is to say, a system's only as good as the increased profitability minus the associated time that you've put in, the upfront time that you put in to create that lean system.
Cool, thanks.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I hope that answers Anonymous's question. If Anonymous would like to ask a follow-up question, they can unmute themselves and do so. I might just follow that up myself with, I mean, is there a case where lean is maybe not the right system for a very new business that's still trying to experiment. So like your first in, first out system immediately makes the whole thing quite restrictive because you're making a sort of homogeneous product.
Right.
Is it dangerous to start trying to optimize too soon?
I think the answer to that question is it really depends on the farm business model. For example, if you're mass producing one crop, I should have gone into this in detail in the talk as well, but if you're mass producing one crop, then it's best to design your whole system in mind with that particular crop in mind, where you can apply the first in, first out principle. If you want to stay agile, for example, where you're able to grow a different host of crops, then maybe it's a little less appropriate to lock in your system to be designed for that individual crop in mind. That is to say, having an adaptable climate control around that you can adjust according to the different crop that you're growing continuously would be more appropriate. The first in, first out principle is an idea suggested that you could apply if it was appropriate, but it's not appropriate in every case.
Cool, thanks. Right, next question. We have another anonymous question which says, can you give an example of how signage could reduce the need for quality assessment? You mentioned it briefly in the last.
Sure. So one of the challenges that we encountered occasionally was there was perhaps a lack of communication around what the finished product of having the box with 4 live lettuces in and the herbs in the middle would actually look like. Sometimes the crops would be too small. Sometimes maybe they wouldn't be up to the standard that the director would like it. So even just having a photo of what the box should look like is a nice reminder for people that maybe are either new to the company or people that don't work on the farm every single day but are doing some part-time work, just to remind them without the boss then having to come over and check each individual box to make sure it's up to scratch. We then could result in having to redo all the different already pre-packed boxes that may have taken a few hours to do. Could reduce the amount of time, as well as having signage around some of the maintenance, having those the printed standard operating procedures with pictures in, for example, allows you to avoid having to ask questions as often as could be, or say you forget something, you could always just check the manual and it would have the pictures there to help you. Another visual sign would be with regards to the sump tank, rather than having to kind of check where the minimum point should be, it could just be written on with a marker. It's just these little nudges that help you make the right decision without any back and forth between shop floor employees and the manager.
Yeah, I'm sure that's really helpful when you maybe have, like you mentioned, new staff. Often in companies where, or small, or any operation where someone's been there for a long time and there's all this sort of embedded knowledge inside them, and then they retire or whatever,
yeah, right.
leave or for some other reason, then suddenly there can be a crisis. But any of this established stuff that's easy and doesn't require too many questions, like you say.
Right. Yeah, one of the concepts that they really emphasize is this kind of foolproofing, where you could literally have anyone on the farm and they should be able to intuitively figure out what needs to be done without someone having to tell them. Whether that be just a stranger that you got off the street, it should be evident and mistake proof so that nothing could go wrong. And that's really a big part of that is actually making the employees feel okay to make mistakes and just to communicate why that they make the mistake. It's very kind of people orientated, where rather than trying to treat people like robots in terms of making it more efficient, it's more about making sure that they're part of this operation of continuous improvement and making sure that they refine these processes to become as streamlined as possible.
Yeah, so it's a nice balance between sort of optimization and human frailty.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Nice. Could we have another question from Karen? Karen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your own question? You're welcome to.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Karen.
Yeah, what examples are they of companies that are doing this that would be good for us to maybe look at, or from a UK perspective, but equally from a US or Japanese or European that you'd come.
Right.
And just say I'm very interested. We're looking to set up, but it's not vertical. It will be horizontal, but in a large commercial scale, 10,000 square meter type glass houses. But from what all you're saying, I'd say would be ideal for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, let me suggest that the book, The Lean Farm, provides a really good entry level, some background discussion of how to integrate some of these principles, especially in kind of greenhouse setup and just kind of organic farming. And then companies that I can think of that are using these sort of principles would be Introvision. I spoke to Chris from Harvest London the other day, and they've designed their farm with a lot of these principles in mind. InFarm I mentioned. With greenhouses, I'm a little less familiar. I've been focusing more on vertical farming. But I'll see whether I can find a few examples and send it over to you. There's also a fine line between lean manufacturing and then also integrating automation. And because of this pre-competitive space, a lot of the companies that have a lot of capital and are integrating automotive technologies are also a lot less harder to speak to and to get information about how they're integrating it, because they're a little less inclined to share the knowledge that they've gained, and they spent a lot of money acquiring. So in that sense, the automation aspect to me is a bit of a blind spot. But I'll see whether I can find some greenhouse examples for you.
And while I while I have the floor, if you don't mind me asking another question.
Sure.
Very interesting what you're saying around the labour and the amount of labour, because I'm sure everyone is in the same boat. Like, we're all building models based on significantly probably less labour, but it's trying to then deliver that up until we're up and running. That's when the real test will be in terms of the management of the labour.
Right.
A balance between the automation required and the labour content.
Right. Sorry, what are you asking?
Yeah,
what the balance is between the two?
I know you referred to kind of you saw some Japanese models of kind of
right.
labour down to. What's your experience been in terms of kind of I don't know, how would you classify it per square meter, or how would you classify kind of the labour, the common labour usage in a vertical?
In a vertical setup.
And because everyone's situation is different.
Right.
But is there such a thing as the labour cost per ton, and being able to see a differential between traditional, horizontal, and then vertical? Is that available, or does that exist?
It's currently not available, and there's some discussion in, I think, Artemis, or what was formerly known as AgriList. They released a survey where they gave some average numbers on work man hours per crop setup, but it's really dependent on the farm layout. It's really dependent on the crops that you're growing, and the amount of layers especially. So if you have over 6 layers of either towers or stacked layers, you end up having to get like something like scissor lifts or automation to be able to get to the top of those things. It becomes quite inefficient. If you're a small farm without automation, I'd recommend keeping a cap on around 6 grow levels. But yeah, I think it is quite hard to answer that question with regards to actual numbers, just because each situation is so unique. But I would suggest, in terms of the balance of automation and labour, that anything that feels very monotonous, like sowing seeds and the packaging, should be automating the things that the employees find the most difficult or monotonous to do. Ideally, you want them to be doing tasks that actually require a little bit of thought and aren't just pure manual labor in order to meet profitability.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for a good discussion there, Karen. And thanks, Francis. Right. Any more questions? It looks like our question board is complete. We've been getting some good wisdom from Peter Lane in the chat. I don't know if Peter,
oh, really? Great.
Peter would like to maybe elaborate on anything he's mentioned there. The floor is yours if you want it, Peter. If he's still here.
I hope so, because
sorry, I couldn't find my microphone thingy.
Great to have you here, Peter.
Yeah, this has been an excellent talk. Thank you for inviting me on it. One of the things I was going to just mention, I was busy typing away, is on the manual system, you really got to look at what repetitive movements. You know, when you say you should only go up to about 6 levels, I wouldn't even do that, because an average person is about 5'8", and you have to reach up and twist when you put in trays in or trays out or whatever. And then at the same time for the lower one, you have to bend down and twist and turn. This is murder on the back. So ergonomics is a major worry on any vertical farm process. Yeah, there are ways of avoiding this in some ways, but basically it becomes semi-automatic. But the vertical farming is going to have big problems with repetitive strain injuries. And at the end of the day, you're employing people on minimum wage who will only be too happy to sue you for any damages that they experience over time. So you have to be very careful of that. You know, you pay monkeys minimum wage to do some of this work, and they're just looking for the next paycheck, and the next paycheck could be from suing you. So you have to be very careful on that.
I think that's a really excellent point. I think the ergonomics is something that I didn't really touch upon, but I think there's just so much scope to really break down any setup and really discuss these points that I hope to do in my thesis. This was only a 6-page paper that I'm presenting, but I'd really like to kind of further the research and expose that in more detail.
Well, you covered more in your 6 pages that most of these $100 million companies seem to have done. The next talk I'd like to see is on risk management, and that would be a very interesting one to do, because people don't seem to understand that either.
Yeah, I think I would love to have a chat with you, actually, because I've developed my risk analysis model for the profitability of these companies that I'm prototyping at the moment. I think it'd be really nice to have a discussion with you on that.
Well, we're talking with the RAU at the moment, and hopefully we'll have some good news from them this week or next week at the latest. And these are the sort of things that we want to add to the curriculum down there.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so yeah, we should definitely talk.
Good, and I'll have you both back for a presentation on risk analysis in a few weeks' time then.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Yeah, and maybe something about like complementary Pilates or strength and conditioning training for workers. Great. If that's all the questions done, we're coming up on the hour, but a few spare minutes before your 12 o'clock appointment. Francis, you want to tie up any loose ends?
Yeah, just as I said previously as well, if there's anyone that currently owns a farm that would be interested in making any points about what they've done or what they've experienced around labor efficiency or challenges that they've had, I'd be really interested to hear from you, either whether that's now or happy for you to send me an email. We'd be really open to a discussion with you.
Excellent, great. Well, thank you very much, Francis. Please take him up on his offer for a discussion. I'd like to, as Mark has reminded in the chat, we have future events coming up. The next one is another webinar, research-based webinar from Benjamin van Gansberg from Harper Adams University, which is all about perceptions of sustainability in vertical farming from consumer and producers' perspective. So that's sure to be quite interesting as well. And keep your eyes on the events page on our website for further events, which are currently in the works. All right then, so thank you all for attending, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.